Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter any questions that you may have into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you may have. This is to give you some information about one of our presenters, David Feist. David Feist is an accomplished quality professional, experienced in multiple disciplines of international business, manufacturing, process mapping, organizational effectiveness, emergency management planning for business continuity, Six Sigma, quality improvement methodologies, and total quality management. He is the former owner of China Sourcing Inc., an Asia Pacific manufacturer of industrial products sold throughout the United States, with over 20 years of experience in project management and large-scale project implementation. Mr. Feist established and ran 13 laboratories globally, guiding them through the ISO IEC 17025 registration process. He has also led accreditation assessments to the ISO IEC 17025 and 17020 standards and has been technical witness to qualify 3 environmental assessors for environmental laboratory accreditation. David has also led multiple training classes for private clients, qualifying them for internal assessments of laboratories and inspection bodies. Mr. Feist is currently the ANAB Training Business Manager and a lead assessor for ANAB in both ISO IEC 17025 and 17020 programs. Additionally, he serves on the ANAB Technical Advisory Group as a representative for both the ISO 17025 and ISO 17020 programs. For myself, I've been with ANSI National Accreditation Board for about 9.5 years. I'm an instructional designer and instructor for ANAB. I have designed and delivered training courses on a number of conformity assessment topics, primarily to the forensic community since 2013. Prior to joining ANAB, I spent more than 11.5 years as a quality assurance manager in a forensic laboratory. My portfolio also includes 12 years of conducting research in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries, as well as teaching biology as an adjunct professor at a couple of local universities. I'll now turn this over to David so he can get us started on the webinar on impartiality.
Welcome, everyone. It's good to be speaking and reaching out to everyone. So let's start off by talking about what is impartiality and why is it important. And this is kind of kin to the whole thing of I know what it is when I see it, but I can't describe it. So one of the things that is impartiality, let's talk about an example. If you have an inspector who is reviewing fire doors for fire safety in industrial buildings or hospitals, how do you think that person should be compensated? We've come into a number of organizations where the inspectors were being compensated based upon the number of fire doors for fire safety that they inspected on a daily basis. So if they inspected 80 fire doors in a day, they got paid a certain rate. If they were able to go through and inspect 100, they got a different rate. Do you think that has an impact on the impartiality with which those individuals approach their job and the inspection of the fire safety doors and hardwares? Absolutely, it does. And when we get back to this question of what is impartiality and why is it important, whether you're dealing with testing, whether you're dealing with inspection, whether you're dealing with other areas, that idea of being impartial, being able to conduct a test, conduct an inspection without external influence as to how a decision is made one way or another is extremely important. The other piece of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is impartiality and independence go hand in hand. Um, we won't get too deep into that, but when we go into the ISO standards, particularly ISO 17025 and ISO 17020, a huge portion of those standards in section 4.1 and 4.2 talks about how these activities shall be undertaken impartially. Now, when we talk about impartiality, it is that presence of objectivity. So when we talked in the earlier example, if somebody's compensation is influencing the decision that they're making, then it's not neutral. It doesn't have that presence of objectivity. And when we talk about the objectivity, that without conflicts of interest or conflicts of interest have been resolved so they don't adversely influence the subsequent activities. And I'm sure you can think about many situations in your life where there is an incentive that is applied. You tell your kids, hey, get this done and we'll go out for ice cream. So you've got to think about impartiality in in all of those sequences and all those fashions. And the whole idea is that so that the result of an activity, the result of that testing, the result of that inspection is not compromised by the situation or the action of a particular person. And the evaluation of those results are not compromised in that same fashion. Now, one of the things that we can talk about is, well, how do you do this? And having been a consultant over the years, having assessed a number of organizations, and having done training, one of the activities that I encourage organizations to do is to put together a risk matrix for impartiality. And it's as simple as get a group of 4 or 5 people in a room and start listing down what are risks to your impartiality. And pretty soon you'll have a list of 25 or 30 risks. And then go through and rank those. Rank them from 1 to 5. 1 being, it's a little bit of a risk, but it's not really going to influence us. To 5, hey, this is a huge risk. This can cause us to lose our impartiality and independence in this scenario. This is something we should focus on right away. And in under an hour, most organizations can clearly call out what the risks to their impartiality and independence are. Now, when we talk about impartiality, the decisions we're making need to be based on specific objective criteria rather than being biased, prejudiced, or preferring benefit for any reason. It cannot be partial or biased. So that means that, take for example the gentleman who is performing a fire door inspection. That he has to approach the inspection of every single fire door the same, whether it's the first one or the last one. So his compensation cannot be tied to his performance of that duty. And there are other ways that you can talk about this, and they all come down to being neutral approach. Now, why is impartiality important? Well, when we look at the 17020 standard and the 17025 standard, we're talking about the input of professional judgment. And in particular, the 17020 standard talks about the application of professional judgment. And we have to ensure that that is not being compromised by bias or influence. And that bias can be actual or perceived. If your client believes that there is bias applied, whether it is or not, then your impartiality is going to come into question. And we have to make sure that whether it is through the production of items, whether it's through the inspection of items, whether it's through the testing of items, that those results, whether they are test results, whether they're inspection results, are seen as being impartial and non-biased. And this comes back directly to the integrity and the reputation of the organization that's performing this. So it is critical in that aspect. So as we go through this, what are some of the things that we need to talk about? We need to make sure that any work that is performed is seen as being free from bias and that it actually is free from bias, and that we ensure the independence of those results, that they are not affected by our personal interests or any feelings that we may have one way or another. And how do we do this? Well, we avoid situations that can compromise us. It can be as simple as not being seen in activities that are in conflict with what we're doing. So, for example, if we go back to the example of somebody performing an inspection of an article, they should not be involved in recommendation of repairs for that item. They should not be involved in repairs for that item. They should not be involved in the production of those items. They have to show that they are independent of those activities. You think if somebody was involved in installation of certain hardware, should they be involved in an inspection of it? Absolutely not. That would compromise the impartiality. Yeah. And the other thing is, you have to be able to separate your emotions from the decisions that you're making. Oh, I can't. I know that they need these fire safety doors to operate in order to run this facility, or they're not going to be able to, bring in people to this hospital that are injured. Now, your job as an inspector is to be impartial in how you judge that. Your job as someone that's running a GCMS machine is not to think about how the results are going to be used and how they're going to impact things. It's to give that specific result. And those decisions have to be based on the facts, and they have to be based upon defined criteria. Okay. So what are some of the benefits of impartiality? Well, it's customer confidence in the product, and the product is not only a definable, deliverable item, but it can be confidence in the inspection that is being performed. Let me give you an example right now. Um, One of the largest importers of grain in the Western world is Egypt. And where is a vast majority of that grain coming from? Not only right now, but over the past several years, it's coming out of Ukraine. What's going on in Ukraine right now? Yeah, there's a war going on. One of the things that we as an accreditation body are doing is we're working with the inspection bodies that are based in Ukraine to help maintain the accreditation for their inspection of grain that is being shipped out of that country. It's doing several things. It's maintaining economic cash flow into the country of Ukraine, but it's also maintaining the flow of grains into countries around the world that have a need for that. So, and by having an accredited inspection, when that grain arrives at those ports, it's already cleared for acceptance into the country. So it strengthens those relationships. It establishes and reinforces the culture. It gives confidence in the product that's being delivered, and it gives confidence in the management system. One of the key things of impartiality is that it's not just that the person doing the testing, the person doing the inspection, that needs to be responsible. It goes through the entire management structure of an organization. And if it doesn't, then you cannot be maintaining that impartiality. When we look back to the ISO standards, they specifically talk about inspection, the top management having commitment to impartiality. And if there is a risk to impartiality that's identified, that management team needs to show how it is going to eliminate or minimize that risk. And that goes right into problem solving, figuring out how to eliminate that risk. And it helps build trust and foster open communication between all parties. So at this point, I would like to hand the presentation back over to Emma and let her continue on. Thank you for listening to this point. Emma?
Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction to impartiality. There are 5 principles of impartiality, which are all interconnected. And some of these David has already touched on. But first and foremost, we need to make sure that any decisions that we make while we're doing testing, calibration, or inspections, or any of the activities within our organization, that they're based on objective criteria, as David mentioned, and not appear to benefit one person over another or one customer over another for any inappropriate reasons. We need to ensure that our professional judgment that is used when we make decisions, that's not compromised when we're analyzing results or formulating conclusions, that professional judgment is not compromised or even perceived to have been compromised. That is compromised by bias, conflicts of interest, or undue influence. We must also exercise professional judgment without bias and provide advice, opinions, results, and conclusions which are independent of our personal feelings or interests. Really, for any activity or situation, if a risk to impartiality is identified, we must desist from acting or recuse ourselves from the activity or that situation. And then lastly, ask yourself, how does this look, or how might my actions or activities or advice be perceived? Ask or imagine, what would a fair-minded, informed observer think? Would they perceive or feel that your impartiality might be compromised? How does this appear to our customers? We really want to embrace these principles of impartiality to assist us in maintaining our impartiality, because without impartiality, there might be bias. So you have to think, are you a half empty or a half full kind of person? Whichever way you choose to portray the glass, you must ensure that it is based on that objective criteria and that your professional judgment is without bias, without undue influence, without conflicts of interest. Otherwise, your statement, your action, your activity may be perceived as being biased. So we've talked a lot about this bias. What really is bias? Bias is that tendency or that inclination, that attitude, your belief, or your prejudice toward or against an idea, an object, a group, or an individual. Biases are typically based on our feelings, on our stereotypes that we've learned, or unreasoned or unfair judgment, rather than being based on actual knowledge of an individual or that circumstance. Bias directs how we perceive, how we interact, how we think, how we behave, and how we make decisions. There are 2 forms of bias. One is implicit bias or unconscious bias, and one is conscious bias. Implicit bias is or unconscious bias is bias that comes from our attitudes that are held subconsciously and that affect the way individuals feel and think. But in this situation, they call it unconscious because it's really outside of our control. It's outside of our awareness. It's something that we just do without thinking about it. Implicit bias is really that learned behavior. And we learn this from a very early age by observing our social, our familial, and our institutional environments. It's what we learn by watching through example. Some examples of this unconscious bias or implicit bias is age bias, height bias, beauty bias, could be name or gender bias. Conscious bias, these are biases that we are aware of, that we accept. We know we are being biased and we do it intentionally. For example, I have a preference on airlines that I choose to fly based on my experiences with flying. I consciously and purposefully make the decision to evaluate the airline first that I like to see if they can accommodate my needs. If I don't find that they can accommodate my needs, then I consider other airlines. We have to keep in mind other types of bias, and other forms of bias can include ethical bias, technical bias, or institutional bias. Ethical bias is being asked to carry out work or perform duties that are favorable to the commercial interest of the organization. And these are typically due to undue pressures. These undue pressures affect us in such a way that we tend to lack the professional judgment we need. We negate the code of conduct. We negate other professional requirements that are in place, maybe standards that are in place, or even the law in some situations. So it really goes to not following our code of conduct and bending that ethical bar, so to speak. Technical bias. This is where one selects a method maybe because they are familiar with it, they're more comfortable with it, even if the method is not the latest and greatest or most appropriate. Or possibly an individual is reluctant to challenge the work of a colleague who is a friend, a supervisor, or even someone with which they have a conflict. So instead of speaking up because of that conflict, because of the colleague or the supervisor, they choose to be silent. Institutional bias, this is sometimes called conformity bias or groupthink. This is the tendency for one's own judgment to be influenced by the consensus view. This may have a positive outcome for the organization in that it can help prevent conflicts, because if somebody is not going to speak up because they have a different point of view, that avoids the conflict. But on the other hand, groupthink could result in very poor conduct. There's systematic business failures that could occur because someone is not providing their perspective, they're not challenging the status quo, they're not questioning the organization, they choose to be silent in this situation. Keep in mind as we work through and think about the various types of bias, that for any type of bias, bias is neither all good or all bad. We sometimes think of bias as just negative, but there could be positive or favorable bias. There could be negative or unfavorable bias. We all have our own biases, and how we choose to act on those biases is what makes it positive or negative, or favorable or unfavorable. We do develop biases from what we learn, from gaining knowledge about the world we live in, and from our experiences. Bias does become problematic, however, when our professional judgment is swayed in such a way that it impacts our decisions, how we analyze, how we interpret results and data, or how we formulate our conclusions, or where an individual or a group of individuals are treated differently than others. Biases evolve to allow us to make choices in an efficient manner. So our biases help us to be more efficient, help us make decisions easier. And in some cases, some biases may even protect us from negative consequences. For example, from my education and training as a biologist and from my experience, I know that certain insects in a group of Hymenoptera can sting and cause painful side effects. Thus, I am biased and I avoid any insects that appear to be harmful. We have to remember that our biases do influence our decision making, whether it be conscious or subconscious. And if our biases affect or influence our judgment and decision making to where we are no longer fair, objective, reasonable, or rational about a situation, then the bias is unfavorable and unacceptable. As previously mentioned, our biases are dependent on many variables, including being learned from our training, experiences, and education, as well as learned from our culture and our traditions. So let's take a look at what influences bias. We know that unconscious bias is learned early during childhood from our upbringing, our family, our culture. Additionally, bias is influenced by our religion, our nationality, our education, our life experiences, social media, friends, employment, and coworkers. All of these things help us formulate who we are. We are born naive, but with life experiences, we receive and process this information. It transforms our experiences and our abilities to evaluate that information, and it helps us to form those judgments or make those informed decisions. That's part of life. We need to understand that we have biases, but we also need to understand how we act on those biases. And we need to ensure that the judgments that we make, the decisions that we make, the conclusions that we come to, how we analyze our results, the decisions that come out of all of this information, that they're fair, objective, and with impartiality. So now that we have some information regarding impartiality and biases, let's look at some examples of bias, either actual or perceived. These may be relevant to our work environment. One example of potential bias or not being impartial is having one's salary based on commission. It could be that there are some influences that help us make the decision on getting that sale. We want to go out and do the sell, sell, sell so we can get that commission. I think Dave touched on this a little earlier about the fire doors. And the more fire doors that you inspect, the better your salary is going to be. So there is bias in that action. There may be some influence to make the sale or to ensure that that salary is sufficient in either one of those situations. There could be bias if the owner of the organization is also a manager within the organization. Their decisions may be biased and based on the owner's need for a successful business, or the manager may be perceived as making decisions that are based on the financial influences because he is the owner of the company. For laboratory personnel, there could be a clear form of bias or perceived bias if we were to allow someone to audit their own work. And in some ways, it clearly, I don't think there's any way we could audit our own work and be impartial in that activity. Another example would be if individuals were allowed to cherry pick a peer reviewer or a technical reviewer. That is, they may always pick a friend or a colleague that they like, or someone that shares a similar technical background and interest, or one that they know will not be so critical of their work. An example of potential or perceived bias with our customer could be accepting gifts from our customer. The customer may expect some type of reciprocity in return. Another example of customer bias would be to allow the customer to request a certain individual to perform the work, rather than us following our own methods and procedures in assigning that work and performing that work. Now let's take a look at a few accreditation standards regarding impartiality. There are multiple accreditation standards that actually address impartiality in requirements. Two of those that we have focused on here include 17020 and 17025. There are others, however, that's not specific to these two requirement documents. Some other requirement documents that also include impartiality requirements include 17029, 17024, 17034, and 17043 to name a few. And of course, for certification and accreditation bodies, impartiality is required. But for 17020 and 17025, the requirements are listed here. The organization must specify requirements for the competence, impartiality, and consistency of its activities. And the activity shall be undertaken with impartiality and structured and managed to safeguard that impartiality. So these requirements are come on very quickly in the documents. So they straight away want us to address impartiality within our management system and make sure that we're structuring our management system in such a way that we can undertake all activities with impartiality and then manage that impartiality. Management shall also be committed to impartiality and responsible for impartiality of its laboratory activities or inspection activities. It shall not allow commercial, financial, or other pressures to compromise that impartiality. This sometimes has been referred to that undue influence. Organizations must identify risks to impartiality. And then once those risks to impartiality are identified, they must mitigate those risks. That means they need to do something about it. Mitigation means to minimize or to eliminate those risks. But the risks must be addressed. And lastly, policy and objectives shall address impartiality. So to address impartiality and these impartiality requirements, we really need to understand the risks to impartiality and then how to demonstrate and maintain that impartiality. So listed here are a few risks to impartiality. These risks include internal or external influences or pressures, those undue influences as they may be called. Could be the ownership of the organization or how that organization is governed. Could be financial interests, contracts, or maybe even sharing of resources. There are also risks that could be involved with the management and the personnel of that organization. For all of these risks to impartiality that are listed here, it really comes down to relationships in the end, both internal to our organization and external to our organization, and those influences of those relationships and what they have on our judgment. So let's take a look at some examples of these relationships and how they might influence our judgment. So internal risks include putting undue influence on staff to meet unrealistic benchmarks or performance measures, especially if meeting these benchmarks or performance measures are tied to a pay incentive or a sales commission. Additional internal risks could include relationships that we have with our colleagues and managers, as well as time frames or time influences for meeting expectations. Some external risks that are related to relationships include influences that could come from our customers, where we may favor a customer and treat them differently. Or perhaps we have a customer that makes a special request or specifies specific types of testing. We develop relationships with vendors as well. After using their products and or services over a period of time, we may tend to gravitate to that specific vendor based on that relationship. Additionally, how we choose to portray a product, a service, or a situation may be slanted due to the heightened media interest expressed in that product, service, or situation. So this may be perceived as bias on how we slant that marketing of that product. And a risk to impartiality, whether it's actual or perceived, also may come from the organization's ownership. Whether it's a public organization, a private organization, or if the organization is part of a larger organization. Governance also of an organization could influence risks and impartiality. We could have a board of directors that we may need to report to. We may have impartiality coming from, or a risk to impartiality coming from our stakeholders and meeting our stakeholders' needs, or possibly those oversight commissions. All of those may impose risks to impartiality. To continue with these relationships, there could be financial interests that could impose a risk to impartiality, as we've already talked about. Risk to impartiality may also come from relationships when we have a sharing of resources, allowing others to use our equipment and making the judgment that their results must be accurate and reliable and valid because they used our equipment and we know that our equipment is good. Or vice versa. You may use someone else's equipment that's outside your control, and because you have a favorable relationship with that entity, you assume the equipment is well maintained based on that relationship. And lastly, relationships between management and personnel also pose a risk to impartiality. For example, due to relationships, managers, supervisors may have their quote favorites, or an individual may speak negatively of someone to a colleague that may bias their opinion of that person without justification or cause. With all these risks to impartiality, how do we go about mitigating these risks so we can demonstrate and maintain impartiality? I'm going to show you a 5-step process for demonstrating and maintaining impartiality. This content is actually from the 17025 Academy, Tracy Evans, at the following URL that is noted above. The first step of this 5-step process is to develop a culture that promotes awareness of impartiality. Put the culture in place within your organization. Make it a topic. Talk about impartiality. Talk about why it's important, what impartiality does for your organization, and how the organization will benefit from that impartiality in the end. And make everyone an ownership of that impartiality. So talk about impartiality, include it in your policies, have a code of conduct, then talk about what it means to demonstrate and maintain impartiality. Have those resources available as well to help individuals develop and facilitate their culture and provide training on impartiality. Step 2, obtain personal declarations and commitment, including management commitment to impartiality. Step 3, identify and address any risks to impartiality. Step 4, we need to safeguard impartiality status once it's established. And then lastly, step 5 is to monitor impartiality. So once you have mechanisms in place that demonstrate and maintain impartiality, follow up and monitor to see if those mechanisms or approaches that you've put in place are effective. We're going to dig a little deeper into steps 2, 3, and 4. For step 2, this is to obtain personnel declarations and commitment, including management's commitment to impartiality. You could have individuals read and sign a code of conduct or some other form of declaration that they have read and understand the importance of impartiality. I think the majority of organizations have some type of code of conduct or code of ethics or some type of employee handbook, especially for new employees that come in that typically have to sign that and declare that they understand these policies, rules, and procedures. You can have a conflict of interest policy where individuals need to disclose those conflicts of interest, either actual or perceived conflicts of interest. They may have these from prior employment, from personal relationships, or from financial interests. For management, it's important for them to be the facilitators and the leaders of impartiality, to demonstrate and maintain impartiality. So develop an impartiality policy or a statement declaring their commitment to impartiality. Discuss impartiality during management meetings, during staff meetings. Be transparent about impartiality discussions and decisions that are made regarding impartiality, and be aware of changes within the organization that could really impact the impartiality status. And then demonstrate that management will follow up and evaluate risks to impartiality when they're identified. And make sure get everybody involved. Make sure that it's an open communication process and that everybody is responsible for maintaining and demonstrating impartiality. Step 3 is about identifying and addressing any risks to impartiality. And this is a requirement in 17025 and 17020. We must identify risks to impartiality. And once they are identified, we have to mitigate those risks. One way about going about doing this is to establish a risk-based thinking approach. This is a proactive approach for identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risks on that ongoing basis. You can assign personnel or teams to assist with identifying risks, for tracking risks, for addressing risks. You can do a risk assessment, then make a list, discuss the risks identified, and then at regularly scheduled staff meetings, get everyone involved to come up with solutions to address the risks. I have listed here a few methods or approaches that you can use for identifying risks, from brainstorming to interviews to surveys. Once you've identified those risks, then analyze and evaluate them and come up with your risk response or the action that you're going to take to address that risk. There are various risk-based thinking tools and techniques available for identifying and addressing risks, and one good reference or resource is the ISO document 31010. For safeguarding impartiality, you have to think about all of the things that you've put in place to address impartiality. And once all of those mechanisms and tools are established in place, we have to safeguard what we have. And one way about going about doing this is making sure that when we are looking at our management system, that we're managing the changes within that organization. And then also from the get-go that we consider risks, so to speak. That is during recruitment, when we're planning, when we're developing, putting our policies and procedures in place. Think about risks from the beginning. Think about how we're training our employees. Think about how we're addressing and identifying risks. So put this in place with that planning of the organization during the training of staff and employees. Consider impartiality and risk to impartiality right up front and on an ongoing basis to help safeguard that impartiality. So all in all, in summary, understanding and maintaining impartiality will help to ensure that results and/or products that we deliver to our customer are valid and accurate and reliable and of a certain level of quality, and that the interpretation and that the reported results are without bias, that they're objective and that they're fair. In the end, this will protect the reputation and the integrity of the organization and provide greater customer and staff confidence, as well as strengthen those relationships. So just to let you know that there will be coming a self-paced training course on understanding and ensuring impartiality in daily activities that will go into a little bit more detail, or actually a great bit more detail, on what we've discussed here today. So this brings us to the end of our webinar for today. I would like to ask if there are any questions. Please go ahead and type those into the Q&A section or panel, and we will address those questions. And as we see those coming in, I just want to let you know about some additional resources. So thank you, Dave, for your part of the presentation. We do have a few questions that have come through, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But let me give you some information about some of these additional resources that we have for you. There are these webcasts that you are aware of. These are the free pre-recorded videos that provide additional information on accreditation and standard requirements. We have webinars that are free as well, the live informational sessions. These are offered once a month, so check back frequently to see what the next topic will be for next month. We have the ANAB blog page that you may not be aware of. This has a wealth of information related to risks, accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. Additionally, ANAB offers live, online, in-person, and self-paced training in many different areas, including internal auditing, standard requirements, measurement confidence, and risk analysis, as well as the up-and-coming new course on understanding impartiality. So ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management system, and assessments. On the ANAB website, you can find where all of this information is located. So I encourage you to just peruse the website and look for the various types of information that would be beneficial for you. So with that, I would like to now circle back to any questions that we have. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. However, if we don't have time for the questions, we'll be sure to post the answers to those questions with the webinar recording.
Emma, I see the one of the first questions here is, I'm in an organization and I am questioning the impartiality of the testing that is being done. Is there a methodology that should be followed to question this impartiality?
Oh, that's a great question, David. And I think there are quite a few things that laboratories tend to put in place that help actually protect the way that we do our testing. That is to ensure that the testing is done impartially. And one of those primary things that we do is that peer and technical review. So that peer and technical review is set up in a sense to help ensure that the work and the testing or the calibration or even the inspection activities that we're performing are done according to the procedures that we have in place. So peer technical review is one mechanism, and certainly even going back and showing that we have standard methods in place and SOPs in place that everyone is supposed to be following those also goes to ensure that the results the conclusions that we've come to have been done with impartiality. Yeah, many other things also go into that. You can think about all those other mechanisms that you have in place, from proficiency testing to ensure individuals are competent, and even the internal audits and the management reviews that we do go to evaluate our system from input to output to ensure that we're maintaining that impartiality from input to output. Yeah.
There's also a question here specific to what you just mentioned, peer and technical review. Is peer and technical review required for unaccredited organizations?
It is not. It is not one of those requirements for an unaccredited organization. It's even in 17025, it's one of the recommended things to do, but there's not a specific requirement that says you must do technical review. I know for some entities, they do have supplemental requirements that make it a requirement to do a peer and technical review. But for some documents, that is not a requirement. So it's a good practice to put in place. So there is
Okay,
a question. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was going to say another question that has come in says, what is a method to address risk when the risk is the oversight commission that approves and denies if risk was addressed appropriately? Oh my gosh, that's sort of a catch-22, and that's a difficult question. Right. So, what do you do in that situation where you have to address the risk? And part of the risk is that oversight commission, because that was listed as a risk to impartiality. And I think it kind of goes back to who is on that oversight commission, and do they have things in place to address their potential conflicts of interest? And that's something to go back. It's the same with the board of directors. If you have a board of directors that's overseeing an organization, typically that board of directors is selected in such a way that the conflicts of interest are either disclosed, you know their background, you know where they're coming from, you know their position. And so in that selection of that board or that selection of that commission, I think it's important to have the same things considered there that we have to consider for ourselves in the laboratory regarding impartiality. What is the code of conduct for the board? What do they do regarding conflicts of interest? How are those things disclosed? And where is that transparency in the individuals that are serving on that board and their position regarding the work that we conduct in the laboratory? Dave, do you have any?
I think there's also a different, I'm not sure you've addressed the base question there,
Yeah.
because the base question was, what if the conflict of interest is emanating from the group that is responsible for controlling that conflict of interest or that risk management? So one of the ways of addressing that is there is the option, if this is an accredited organization, to address that with the accreditation body, someone like ANAB, and say that we believe that there is a conflict of interest here. There is a formal methodology for doing that, and as part of that, the accreditation body is required to go back and review that complaint or that incursion. So that is, if you find yourself in the position where you believe that the impartiality of your organization is questionable, that if it is an accredited organization, you have that avenue to pursue. And that is one of the things that we encourage, and it has to be there as part of the accreditation process. Thank you.
Oh, that's excellent information, David. Thank you very much for providing that.
All right, that seems to address the questions that are on the table right now. We appreciate
There's
everyone's
one. I'm sorry, Dave.
participation.
There is one more question that came in the Q&A panel. Very quickly, it says, how do you deal with impartiality in terms of internal audit when it's a small laboratory? Specifically, they're stating they're a quality officer who sometimes may do peer review, and then during the internal audit, they would audit the technical processes, which would that be considered as a breach
No,
of impartiality?
it really would, it really would not. One of the things that we recognize as an accreditation body is that there may be organizations that are one or two individuals, and they are required to wear multiple hats. The thing that we assess for and the things that we look for are that that organization is able to define those responsibilities, and the accreditation, which goes back to 17011 standards, does not require that that the execution of internal audits, the execution of testing, be completely independent from one another. What it requires is that we have to recognize that, and we have to account for that. We have to say, this is how we manage that risk to impartiality, and it be identified. When we talked early in the presentation about identifying what those risks are, the key to this is making sure that we identify those risks, we set in place an action plan, and that we be open and honest about those risks. That's the key. It's not that we can draw black and white and say, this, because we've only got three people involved here and they're doing this activity and this activity and this activity, that they must not be impartial. No, it's a matter of how we handle that risk.
I agree. Very good. Thank you so much for that explanation. Okay, so now I think with that, not seeing any additional questions coming in, I would like to thank all of you for your participation today in this webinar. Here's some additional contact information for you if you need some information related to training or information related to accreditation services. So thank you all very much for your participation, and hope to see you back again next month for our next webinar. All right, have a great rest of your day, everyone.